Good afternoon, everyone. Our next presenter, she spoke this morning, but she's going to speak again on EMFs, is Bojana Jankovic Weatherly, who is an award-winning physician, board-certified in internal and integrative medicine. She's also trained in functional medicine, nutrition, and mindfulness. Her approach is rooted in evidence-based medicine that is personalized to each individual she works with. She partners with patients to discover and address the root causes of their conditions and develops individualized plans to support and empower each unique individual to achieve her or his health goals. So let's give her a warm welcome.
Thank you. Hi. I see some familiar faces from this morning. But I'll go ahead and make an introduction for some of the people that weren't here this morning as well. So the topic of this afternoon's talk is going to be EMF radiation and our health. How strong is the evidence of harm, and what can we do to protect ourselves? So let me share with you a little bit about what kind of led me on this path of practicing integrative medicine and really looking at some of the environmental toxins and some of the strategies in which we can use preventative medicine to prevent as well as reverse the rise of chronic disease. So who was here this morning actually for my talk? Okay, so I apologize to you guys for repeating part of this, the introduction this morning, but I started out as an internal medicine physician, and really I didn't see that in my future integrative medicine or really didn't necessarily even have the awareness when I started of all of these toxins that we're being polluted with that are significantly impacting our rates of chronic disease. And so my trajectory really shifted, and I started incorporating some of the modalities and some of the ways in which we look at these triggers and the root causes of disease as I started to learn more about what's going on. And so this morning I shared a little bit about some of the toxins that I was initially exposed to as an internal medicine resident who also happened to be pregnant twice during internal medicine residency and had stressor as the main toxin. And really that was the initial introduction to integrative medicine and proactive self-care, which is really what we're talking about today, right? So we have our conventional model of healthcare that really focuses a great deal of funds and efforts on managing disease, right? But what we're dealing with here is a rise of chronic disease, whether it's diabetes, whether it's cancer rates, whether it's childhood diseases that we heard about earlier today. And we're not necessarily putting as much time and effort and emphasis on prevention, as well as looking at all of the possible triggers of this. And so today we're specifically going to focus on the EMFs. And so this morning as well, I shared a little bit about what are considered to be the foundations of health and healing, because we know that as we optimize our environment, as we proactively take care of ourselves, we're priming our body's ability to heal, right? And so this talk is going to mainly focus on the environmental impacts and toxin reduction, and in this particular case, in the form of EMFs. It's important to keep all of the different pillars of health in mind, but this afternoon we'll zoom into EMFs. So we know that wireless is all around us, right? So we all own a cell phone, and I hope that none of you have that cell phone in your pocket right now, because if you do, please take it out and put it as far away from you as possible. We also know that we're having this increase now in the different frequencies that we are being exposed to, the 5G and the internet network, and we're all surrounded by it. And we have these smart cities, right? And this is just one depiction of the fact that wireless, that it's all around us, but is it really smart for our health? And what can we do to protect ourselves? So let's talk a little bit about the roadmap today of what we're going to be discussing. We'll go into what are EMFs and how are they different from ionizing radiation, which we know has a strong correlation with cancer. What do EMFs do on a physical level? What are the sources of EMFs? What do we currently know and understand about EMFs' effect on our physiology or their biological effect? What do we know about the negative effects of EMFs on our health? And what are the medical applications of EMFs to treat disease? Because there are some cons and there are some pros if we apply it specifically in a targeted way. And then what can we do to protect ourselves finally? So what are EMFs? So EMF stands for electromotive force. So it's the electrical potential energy per unit charge that causes current to flow through a circuit from point A to point B. It also stands for electromagnetic field. So how are these fields generated? So this is actually a picture of my son's hand. So this is your right hand. So if current is flowing from point A to point B, then the magnetic field is created around that wire. So this is your electromagnetic field that's created when current flows through. The greater the voltage difference between point A and point B, so the greater the difference in the charge, the greater the current is going to be. And the greater the current, the greater the magnetic field. Now, what about radiation? Well, radiation refers to emission of energy that travels in the form of waves or particles through space or another medium, like our body. Electromagnetic radiation is the wave-like mode of transport in which energy is carried by electric and magnetic fields. So here I'm just going to share the electromagnetic spectrum. So here we see in this part of the spectrum the very high energy, high frequency ionizing radiation. And this we might know from our diagnostic devices such as X-rays or CT scans, right? This is powerful ionizing radiation, and we'll talk a little bit about the effects of that. Now, in this other end of the spectrum, we have non-ionizing radiation. And so this might come in the form of sunlight. It might come in the form of infrared or UV light, as well as in the form of what our devices are emitting. So whether it be our mobile phones, our kitchen appliances, smart meters that we heard about yesterday as well, baby monitors even, or Wi-Fi, these are all considered to be non-ionizing radiation in this part of the spectrum, and we'll talk a little bit about the division. And then we've got the power lines here, again, lower frequency, but longer wavelengths. And I know there was a little bit of a discussion yesterday about the fact that these shorter wavelengths, they don't tend to travel as far because they have difficulty getting through the, let's say, humidity in the air. But the longer wavelengths can travel farther away. And so this was one of the things that was being raised last night when we were talking about 5G, where these shorter wavelengths, because they can't travel as far, we have to have more cells closer together so that these waves can be transmitted. So what's the difference between ionizing radiation, right, this high frequency spectrum, versus the non-ionizing? Well, with ionizing radiation, the energy particles, the particles have such high energy that they can actually knock off electrons from atoms, molecules. As a result, what we get is indirect or direct DNA damage by essentially creating an unstable radical that then goes on to impact our DNA. Now you can imagine if this DNA isn't fixed by our DNA repair mechanism, we get accumulation of DNA damage over time, and as a result, cancer or other chronic disease can result. What about non-ionizing radiation, which we're going to focus on today? So this doesn't carry enough energy to remove an electron from an atom or a molecule. So there's no direct DNA damage or structural change. And this is why there has been a lot of discussion and such polarized literature really on the effects of non-ionizing radiation. But what it can do is it can excite an electron. So it can move it to a higher energy state, and it can move atoms in a molecule around, causing them to vibrate, which may generate heat. There are also some biological effects of non-ionizing radiation of lower energy that we're going to discuss. And these turn out to be the effects that are likely causing downstream effects, such as chronic disease or some of the symptoms that have been mentioned over the last day. So what are some of the natural sources of radiation, right? This is another question that often gets asked is, well, if we're exposed to radiation all the time from natural sources, does this really matter? So let's break it down. So there's ionizing radiation from the natural sources, and we can divide this up into cosmic radiation that's coming from the sun and the stars, into radiation from Earth, from our radioactive materials, and then internal radiation, even just our own radioactive emissions. And then non-ionizing radiation, again, coming from Earth's magnetic field, sunlight, as I mentioned, and so on. Now, what about human-made sources of radiation? Well, they're everywhere. As I mentioned, there's the ionizing radiation on the left, and that might be considered in the forms of radiation therapy for people undergoing cancer treatments or diagnostic imaging, such as CT scans or X-rays or tanning beds. And then there's this non-ionizing radiation piece. And as you can see, this is really ubiquitous, and it's coming from so many different sources. And just to give us an idea of the magnetic fields generated, so this here in the lower end of the magnetic field spectrum generated would be power lines and radio waves, and we're going to talk about their effects. And then this is the Earth's magnetic field right here. Okay, so let's break it down a little bit. So we know that the energy increases as we go here from left to right, right? So the longer wavelengths have lower energy, higher wavelengths, less energy. And energy increases as we go from left to right. So at this higher, we talked about it, right? We have DNA damage that occurs. At this slightly lower end of the energy spectrum, we have optical effects, electron excitation. Again, at the lower end of the range, we have thermal effects that can induce high currents and heating. And finally, in the lowest end of the spectrum, we have the non-thermal effects that may induce low currents and the biological effects downstream that we'll talk about. And so one of the topics that we'll specifically discuss are going to be radio frequencies. And here I've just labeled them in blue. So basically what I've done here is just broken down this non-ionizing radiation spectrum into how they're classified. So we go from extremely high frequency in the radio frequency range down to very low frequency. And the frequencies are measured in hertz. So extremely high frequency is in the order of magnitude 30 to 300 gigahertz, which is very, very high frequency. And then very low frequency would be 3 kilohertz to 30 kilohertz. So what about 5G? Is this in the EM spectrum? Absolutely. So 5G is the 5th generation of wireless network technology that allows for faster transfer of more information. And this tends to be in anywhere from 2 to the 40 gigahertz range. So it's a pretty wide range in that electromagnetic spectrum. So higher frequencies that we talked about that have higher energy are typically used in the cities. More data is in demand. There are a lot of devices in use. They carry more data. But as I mentioned, over shorter distances, because they have significant attenuation in space, again, due to humidity, due to various factors. And because they can't travel very far, cell towers are being put in very close to each other. Now, lower frequencies are typically used in rural communities. Information can travel farther, and it's less affected by moisture in the air. So why is 5G becoming widely used? Well, wireless connection is everywhere, right? So internet connects vehicles and facilitates vehicle to infrastructure connection, roads, railways, satellites, self-driving cars. And there's also a growing consumer demand, right? We want everything now. People are consuming more data on phones, right? Like watching videos on their phones. This is why 5G is being implemented. So should we be worried about 5G? Well, human bodies absorb 5G radiation as well as other cell phone wireless radiation, right? So this is why we don't want our phones in our pockets or anywhere near us. And then we also mentioned the increase of number of cells in order to transmit that 5G. So those are two big concerns. So how are we being protected from the industry's increase in EMFs? So unfortunately, we're not at present time being protected, so this is why we're talking about this. So I've just added a couple of links here that I'm happy to share after today's talk, where Senator Colbeck testifies against 5G deployment in 2018 due to adverse health effects. There's also a video of Senator Blumenthal that raises concerns about 5G. And what was established in the second video is that there's no industry money going into funding independent studies on EMF safety, and in particular into 5G. No industry money is going into studying this. Yet we have, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of the mechanistic correlations and plausible ways in which it impacts our health, but also some epidemiologic studies, which I'll share. So how do EMFs really alter our biology, right? They don't knock off electrons from our atoms and molecules. They don't cause that direct DNA damage. So what do they actually do? Well, it's hypothesized that the alterations in our biology and our physiology occurs through these non-thermal or non-heating effects. And biological effects are thought to play a major role. So a chain of events will happen as a result of electromagnetic fields that'll change the certain protein interactions and certain pathways in our cells that we'll talk about. One of the ways in which we're being affected is actually by activation of voltage-gated calcium channels, and this is something that was mentioned last night as well. And this is thought to produce some adverse as well as some potentially beneficial effects. Again, when used in a targeted way. So the voltage-gated calcium channels, what do? They detect voltage changes due to EMFs. So they're on the cell membrane. When activated, let's say by EMF, they open and they allow calcium to flow into the cell. This calcium flow into the cell can induce a number of changes within that cell. So it's supported by a number of studies that low-intensity microwave EMFs can induce changes in calcium fluxes and changes in calcium signaling. So we know that this mechanism exists. This has been shown in studies. In addition, this voltage-gated calcium channel activation by low-intensity microwave EMFs can produce oxidative stress responses and oxidative stress in our cells. And that's one of the mechanisms by which chronic disease or cancer can occur. It's interesting that medications for high blood pressure, this was also shown in Dr. Pal's research, medications for high blood pressure, such as calcium channel blockers, you may know them as amlodipine as one example, they block opening of calcium channels, so therefore they block these effects of EMFs. So again, supporting evidence that these channels are implicated as one mechanism. And again, this is just one depiction of it. I'm just going to circle things that are relevant because I know this is a busy slide. So we have these low-frequency microwave EMFs, activation of voltage-gated calcium channels, calcium flows into the cells, and then we get reactive oxygen species and ultimately pathophysiological effects. So how do EMFs alter our biology through this? So calcium influx sets a series of events that can lead to stimulating bone growth, for example. They result in oxidative stress, as I showed before. They can also result in DNA damage, right? If we have reactive oxygen species, these are reactive, they can ultimately cause some DNA damage. This was shown in 2 cell studies. The mechanisms have yet to be completely elucidated. So pulsed EMF, which is a force vibration of all of the free ions on the surface of the cell's membrane, are caused by an external oscillating fields. These can also be used in a therapeutic way as well. So does EMF cause cancer? So the International Agency for Research on Cancer classified radiofrequency EMF as a possible human carcinogen. Recent studies found reproductive, metabolic, and neurologic effects of radiofrequency EMFs as well. So why did IARC classify EMFs as a possible carcinogen? What's the data? So there are different sets of data that they looked at for this. They looked at epidemiologic studies, right? Population studies. They looked at experimental studies in humans, experimental studies on animals. They looked at cell culture studies as well that are focused more on what the mechanism is behind it, and also studies on biophysical mechanisms as well. So let's talk a little bit more about the research on health effects. So we're going to start with some of the evidence for cancer. So again, another study that was mentioned earlier, the interphone study. So this was the largest case control study looking at whether radiofrequency emitted by mobile phones is carcinogenic. So what's a case control study? So the study identified cases of people with certain types of brain tumors, as well as controls, people who didn't have brain tumors. They then asked those individuals to report their use of mobile phones. And then based on this, the correlation was determined. So in this particular study, this was a multi-center study over several different countries. There were 6,000 cases identified with certain type of brain tumor and over 7,000 controls that didn't have the brain tumor. And I listed the studies down here. So what did they found? They found that in the first 10 to 15 years after first mobile phone use, there's not likely to be a material increase in the risk of adult brain tumors due to mobile phone use. I just want to make a note here that cordless phone use was not measured in this study, which is also known to be a significant source of EMFs. There's also a potential for a longer lag period for cancer formation, right? We know that cancer takes years and years to form from initial exposure. And so if we're really studying effects for 10 to 15 years, we're not necessarily getting the data for what happens after 20, 25 years. We've talked a lot about children in the last day. So if we imagine our kids that are being irradiated basically from the time they're a fetus, this type of study certainly can't be extrapolated to children because of where they're not just little adults, right? Their brains are developing, but also because of the length of exposure. So a few other findings that I wanted to share. So acoustic neuroma, which is a benign type of brain tumor, this particular study did not find an increase of acoustic neuroma with people that ever used a mobile phone, and for people who began to regularly use phones 10 years or more before the reference date. And then the odds ratio for the highest cumulative call time, so they basically subdivided people depending on their cumulative use of their mobile phones. So the odds ratio for those that use their mobile phones for the greatest length of time was more than double in individuals with acoustic neuroma. So if we just isolate these people that were the highest users, they actually did have a greater incidence of acoustic neuroma. But no trend was found prior to this threshold. So it could also be that there could be a certain threshold above which there's a higher rate. So a study or a commentary on the interphone study came out that essentially concluded the biological literature on RF and cancer does not support an etiologic effect. Extensive research hasn't established any biological mechanism by which RF fields, which are not mutagenic, could cause cancer. And animal experiments have given no replicable evidence for cancer causation in mobile phones and brain tumors. So they're basically saying there's not enough evidence to support this. But let's look a little bit more into the entire literature to date that has been done. So here I'm showing the survey of the literature up to 2006. So on this page, all of the studies that are shown are not showing an increased risk of brain tumor with cell phone use. However, I also want to point out that many of these are small studies and some of them have very short follow-up. So again, there's a question of, well, how applicable are they to real world? Number one, because we are exposed for more than 5 years, right? And in today's world, many people are exposed for lifetime. And then number two, with small studies, we may not be able to detect this. And we know, and I'll talk a little bit about further down the road, but we also know that part of our population is more vulnerable for one reason or another, whether those are genetic differences, whether those are other toxins that they're dealing with. So again, these studies are looking at the population view, but if the study population is very small, we may not be able to detect those subtleties. So this particular part of the study did show some positive studies for brain tumors with a longer latency period. And again, I want to point out that all of these studies that showed the positive correlation were greater than 10 years. So again, there is validity and importance to doing long-term studies so that we can truly understand what the effects are. Another review here looked at 16 case control studies, and this found that there was an association between brain tumors and cell phone use. So you can see, based on the heterogeneity of the population, the length of time that people were studied, that there are multiple different sets of data where we really need to find what are the cutoff points, what is the lag time. And again, who are the vulnerable populations? And then another study here shows a compelling argument for this causative relationship, right? Because as I talked about earlier, there are associations that we can make, but we also need to mechanistically understand, well, what could be the possible reason for a causative effect? Does A cause B? And so this particular study, so they looked at adults between the ages of 18 and 75. They had almost 600 individuals with a malignant brain tumor that were the cases. And as controls, they had almost 1,400 individuals with no history of malignant brain tumor. And then they looked at the odds ratio. So this study is a little bit more recent than some of the other studies, and also implying that there's a longer use of mobile phones. So they looked at the odds ratios, looked at the likelihood of mobile phone use for individuals with a malignant brain tumor compared to controls. So what did they find? Well, they found that actually there is a statistically significant correlation, and that the odds ratio of mobile phone use for cases for people that did have malignant brain tumors is higher, almost 2 times higher on average. They also found that this odds ratio increases with over 25 years since first exposure. So it was longer follow-up as well. So we know that there's this dose-response effect and this cumulative effect as well. And then they looked at the odds ratio for 2G mobile phone use. That was about 1.6 times greater, again, in people who were diagnosed with a malignant brain tumor. So what they found is that overall, the odds ratio increases with the greater time since the first use of cell phones. So the more we're exposed, the greater the odds ratio is. And actually, in this particular study as well, the cordless phone use was measured as well. So here's just one of the figures from this study, so showing the dose response between exposure to cell phones and the malignant brain tumor development. So this is the cumulative use of the wireless phone in hours, and then this here, it's the odds ratio. So really just showing that the greater the cumulative use, the greater the odds ratio, and the greater the correlation between malignant brain tumor and cell phone use. So what about our children, right? I mentioned that these studies really are an indication of what's happening with our adult population, but what about children that have been exposed from the time they're a fetus, right? So in this particular study, also no one had used a mobile or cordless phone. No one used it for over 25 years, in the previous study. So this is really what's relevant with our children and why we need longer follow-up and why we really need to look at our pediatric populations and what's happening with children from the time they're born. So why are there these conflicting studies? So there are a number of reasons. Number one, selection bias, right? So in some studies, actually, authors have proposed that perhaps their controls, the under-selection of unexposed controls. So they hypothesized that maybe some of their controls had more usage than what a regular control would have. And so that's why we're not seeing such a big difference between the odds ratios of people who are getting the malignant brain tumor and the people who are not. The other aspect could be reporting bias. So all of these studies were asked to report their cell phone use, but how reliably can we really report this? I mean, to create one analogy, so with a lot of the nutrition studies, we use food frequency questionnaires. Well, who remembers exactly what they had to eat yesterday and in what doses and how much or how many minutes they were on their phone? So we really need more reliable data collection to really be able to make a more reliable and quantitative connection between these things. There's also the inter-user variation in use. So again, this reduces the power of the interphone study. So there was a lot of heterogeneity between these subgroups of the interphone study that kind of dilutes the possible effect. And also study populations might be different. As I mentioned earlier, some people might be more vulnerable to the effects, and that's not something that we're capturing in these large studies, and certainly something that we have to pay attention to. And then different duration of studies. Certain chronic diseases, as well as cancer, they take years and years to surface and to really capture this effect. So we need longer term follow-up data. And then lastly, other sources of EMFs are not always being captured in studies. So I mentioned that some of the studies didn't look at cordless phone use, which are also a significant emitter of EMFs. So we really need to capture all of the different sources to reliably be able to say, based on such and such cumulative exposure, the long-term data shows this increased effect. So these are some of the possible explanations as to why we're getting so many different confusing results, and some of the studies are negative or not showing that effect. So what can we do? So essentially, I just already said that. So reliable cell phone use reporting. We need to be able to quantify other radiation exposures. We need to learn more about the predisposition to radiation sensitivity and which genetic variations to look for to identify those at higher risk. And then we need longer-term follow-up. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about thyroid, because as you may know, thyroid is a radiosensitive organ, and thyroid cancer is related to radiation. So this particular study was done out of Connecticut. It's also a case control study, but in this case, they were looking at confirmed thyroid cancer cases versus controls, people who didn't have thyroid cancer. And they had over 400 people in both the case category and the control category. And they found that when you look at everyone, they didn't find an association between sinful use and thyroid cancer. However, they found a non-statistically significant increase, and remember this is a smaller population too, but a non-statistically significant increase in thyroid microcarcinoma, so a smaller tumor size, in those who were longer term and frequent cell phone users. And they also found that those who had the most cumulative use in terms of hours and cumulative calls also had a non-statistically significant trend towards a greater odds ratio of thyroid microcarcinoma. So then the same group asked the question of, well, why do some people have the increased risk of thyroid microcarcinoma and others don't? Is there a difference among the individuals in this large population, in this population that we studied? So they went on to study genetic susceptibility in the context of cell phone exposure leading to thyroid cancer. And the other thing also that I wanted to share is cell antennas tend to be located at the bottom of cell phones, right? Which you can, if you're holding up your phone here, and if your antenna is down here, that's really close to your neck, and your thyroid is at the base of the neck, right? So that's another reason for this relevance to thyroid cancer in particular. And they found that the peak radio frequency actually occurs right here. So what did they find with this genetic variation? Well, they found that there's an increase, that there are certain genetic variations that may predispose people to developing thyroid cancer as a result of cell phone use. So it basically goes cell phone use, exposure, increased genetic susceptibility, then determines or makes it more likely for somebody to have the effects of that. So again, that's another aspect that could be diluting, again, some of the studies that are not necessarily just looking at the vulnerable individuals, but that are looking at the large population. And what's really interesting is that, well, you might ask then, well, what are these genetic susceptibility genes, right? What do they have to do with cancer? So the particular ones that were studied here, and the study was just published actually earlier this year, is they specifically looked at variations in proteins that play an important role in tumor suppression and growth. And so these are the ones that really modulated this effect, or that really affected how radiofrequency radiation basically increases the risk of thyroid cancer. So what did they conclude? Well, this follow-up study where they looked at genetic susceptibility found that yes, there are certain genetic variants, and they're called SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. So these are just very, very tiny, tiny variations that can actually change the way that tumor suppression and growth are affected by radiation. And so this supports the case, right, that there is a role for genetic predisposition in certain individuals and the effect of radiofrequency radiation in them. Now, what about, again, we talk a lot about children. I just wanted to share one very large study about children with leukemia. So another case control study that looked at the effect of EMFs and essentially the distance to high voltage power lines that the children were living in, and whether this increased their risk of leukemia. So this particular study was done in England and Wales, and they looked at records of 29,000 children with cancer, and 9,700 had leukemia. And these were children aged 0 to 14 years old, and then they matched them with controls. And specifically in terms of distances, what they looked at is the children who lived within 200 meters, between 200 and 600 meters from the power lines, and then children that were greater than 600 meters. So they found that children within 200 meters from the power line, around the time of their birth, had a subsequent greater risk of developing leukemia that was up to 2.5 times greater than somebody who lived greater than 600 meters away. So we know that, again, there's this dose response relationship, and there's this distance relationship based on this study. And those born between 200 and 600, so who were kind of in the middle, they also had an increased risk of leukemia, but their risk was less than those that were very, very close, within 200 meters. So again, another study supporting this dose relationship. However, the authors still concluded that this time there's no accepted biological mechanism to explain the epidemiologic results. So let's talk about what this biological mechanism might be, because there are actually some really interesting studies that have come out that propose further mechanisms beyond the voltage-gated calcium channels, which I talked about before. So this particular study that was published a couple of years ago shows that there are some mechanisms that could be at play here. So this particular study was looking at how extremely low frequency magnetic fields, whether they could be possibly carcinogenic, and how do they act within our cells. So what's found, there's this protein cryptochrome that actually birds also have, and this helps them sense the Earth's magnetic fields and when it's time to migrate. And so what's interesting is this cryptochrome then has the ability, this protein has the ability to sense changes in electromagnetic fields. So what this study found is that these electromagnetic fields can influence the cryptochrome, which in turn sends downstream signals that can cause a disturbance in circadian rhythms, right? And a lot of what we hear anecdotally And in one study that I'll mention in a little bit is that people who are very sensitive to EMFs, they might have issues with insomnia. So they affect circadian rhythms, but they also can alter DNA damage responses and cause these reactive oxygen species to form, which down the road can cause genomic instability, so our DNA to become unstable, and then ultimately lead to cancer formation. And again, another study here showing the low intensity magnetic fields that induce cryptochrome to modulate reactive oxygen species. And here's what happens with reactive oxygen species. Once they're created, DNA damage can occur. We see changes in cell division, cell survival, metabolism, aging, and then these antioxidant and anti-inflammatory responses as well. So these reactive oxygen species, they're formed by a partial reduction or gain of electrons by oxygen. They're generated in the cells as part of mitochondrial function. So this normally happens, right? Reactive oxygen species are normally generated. But they can also rise from interactions with foreign compounds or toxins. So we can look at this as a kind of burden. We heard earlier about the allostatic load and about the total load. So it's really, we can think of this in terms of a balance. If there's too much of something, and in this case, reactive oxygen species, this may contribute to further signaling that can activate disease processes, including cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, neurodegenerative diseases, and as I mentioned, cell aging as well. So this is one study that looked at a number of individuals that reported symptoms from exposure to smart meters. And this is an Australian study that was done. And some of the symptoms that were reported include headache, tinnitus, insomnia, abnormal body sensations, dizziness, cognitive disturbances, and fatigue. And so oftentimes, I mean, this is, as a primary care and internal medicine physician, I see this a lot. Patients will come in with a constellation of symptoms that we don't have a great explanation for. And we don't have very well documented large sets of data that, again, shows this causal relationship. But I think this is something that's very, very important to investigate because certainly there's a great deal of anecdotal evidence. And I've heard of so many individuals, again, having these symptoms and then getting better once they clean up their EMF environment. So on the flip side, I also wanted to share, and this is really just one study, that not all EMFs in every setting are bad. We also use EMFs in a very targeted way in the clinical setting. And actually just this one particular study found that breast cancer and liver cancer cell growth can significantly decrease due to EMF treatment. So again, when used wisely, when used for a specific target, it can actually be helpful. So what can we conclude from all of this data and all these different studies that are showing different effects? So we know that there's a growing body of literature of health effects of EMFs. So we know that this is a growing concern. We know that there are studies showing a correlation between brain tumors and EMF, childhood leukemia and EMF, thyroid cancer in susceptible individuals. And then we also have some mechanistic, some biological effects that are plausible that explain this correlation. So one of them may be through reactive oxygen species formation that can cause inflammation, DNA instability, cellular aging, and so on, that can explain these downstream health effects. We also see that there are both positive and negative studies, making it difficult to make definitive conclusions, but it's also important to look at the studies in a critical way and look at the length of exposure, look at the susceptibility of individuals, selection bias, reporting bias, right? There are all flaws in a lot of these studies. So we also need more high quality, consistent data to better characterize, what are the short and long-term effects from EMFs? And then who are the vulnerable populations? So again, although our cells might be able to recover from short-term exposure, in the long term, because we're constantly being surrounded, right, in this ecosystem of EMFs, we really need to think about the long-term exposure before experimenting on ourselves. And it's just important to think of this as, precautionary principle, right? So precautionary principle states that if there are potential dangers, then we need to research them, we need to figure them out. And I mentioned earlier that there's really no great research on 5G, on a lot of the things that again, are being experimented with in our population. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we need to absolutely stop everything, but we need high quality data before moving so fast. And definitely some policies that are going to protect us, because clearly there's enough evidence that there is a correlation. So how do we reduce exposure? So I'm going to share some basics. I know that in some of the other talks too, you've heard some of the ways in which we can do that. So just some simple strategies. Use speakerphone or a wired headset, right? Keep your pocket away from you. Oftentimes we're and I know you guys are already EMF literate, but so many times, right? We see people, cell phones in their pockets. It's just more convenient. So whether you're using it or not, just keep it away. Keep it in a purse, a bag, at your desk, somewhere far away. Keep it outside of your bedroom when you go to sleep. Avoid using Bluetooth. So even though Bluetooth is actually a little bit better than having your phone right here, so it's the lesser evil, but still try to avoid using it. Keep the phone outside your bedroom, as I mentioned. Set your phone on airplane mode at night. Turn your router off at night. Avoid cordless phones as well. Avoid having laptop on top of your lap. Again, just some simple things that we all know, but oftentimes for convenience sake, we don't necessarily practice them. Avoid using cell phones around your child, around anybody who's pregnant. Again, we just don't have enough data, but based on the data that we do have, you can imagine that the effects on our children are going to be even more significant. And then if you can, switch your wireless connection to a wired Ethernet cable. And then I just wanted to share a couple of the resources here. The building biology specialist, and I know we have one here from whom we heard earlier today. And then websites like EMF Safety Store, where you can learn more about the EMF effects and the protection equipment as well. Thank you very much. Any questions? Oh, sorry? Oh, okay, got it. Sure.
So, I saw a brief mention about the circadian rhythm on there, and is there a little bit more you could talk about that? Because I do think that's a tremendously undervalued factor in general health.
Absolutely.
So a little bit more on that?
So other than the clinical and anecdotal data, I can't give you the specific cellular mechanism, but yes, there's definitely been a correlation, and it's something that's been documented in the literature, but I can't give you the specific cellular mechanism for that.
Have you read the Circadian Code by Dr. Sanchez?
I have not, no.
It's really quite eye-opening.
Oh, okay. Great. Thanks. Hi.
I have two questions. One is the danger in using a laptop in your lab. Is it strictly from when you're using wireless? If you're not using the internet at all and your wireless is turned off, would you say that it's still a danger?
That's a great question. Yeah. So in general, when we think about whenever electricity is generated, there's always that magnetic field that's going to be around it. So I don't know specific data on the exposures, and maybe some of the folks who are measuring EMFs can comment more on that, but I would still not use it on my laptop, no.
That was one question. And then the other question might be slightly off topic, but I don't know.
Okay.
Dermatologists lately are using radio frequency on people's faces as a method to try and stimulate collagen regeneration. Dangerous? Not dangerous? Any information on that?
It's a good question. I don't know specific studies looking at the safety of that. That's a really good question. I would always be cautious with any form of radiation that's been investigated and that's been shown to, again, to cause these downstream effects. We also have to think about the dose response and in relation to, again, what's been studied. But that's a really great point. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Thanks.
I noticed on your slides you had MRIs and hyperthermia, which is used widely, in so many medical clinics. Can you say a little bit about how hyperthermia or MRIs are contributing and what the factors would be, how they would impact hyperthermia especially?
So in terms of how they might impact chronic disease development or cancer down the road?
It says, it's part of non-ionizing. So how is
So
hyperthermia
it's part of
that?
So there are certain treatments that use hyperthermia as a treatment modality. So I'm not sure as far as relation to downstream disease process, but there are some applications of EMFs in the medical, like what I mentioned with a very low frequency EMFs, which again is a different mechanism, but on those breast cancer cell lines and so on. So again, there is potential for targeted use for very specific causes that can improve outcomes in those specific disease settings.
I think what I'm asking is when somebody gets a hypothermia treatment in Germany for cancer, are they being exposed to non-ionizing radiation?
Yeah,
Can you say does that happen through hyperthermia? How are they exposed? Does the machine contain it, or how does that?
Oh, that I wouldn't be able to tell you specifically. Yeah.
So you're just saying
in terms of the mechanism, like in terms of
the treatment itself. And then MRI, is that, say a little bit about MRI, how does that?
Sure, so with MRI, so it's a magnetic field. Again, I'm not able to comment on cancer risk down the road or disease mechanisms down the road from MRI exposure, but they are being, absolutely, they're being exposed to a magnetic field.
Yeah, that's, and so, but it's
Absolutely.
not known whether the amount in an MRI causes, it sounds like.
Well, and it's a much higher amount than it's in the order of Teslas. So if you look at the slide is quite early on in the presentation, but the MRI exposure, magnetic field exposure, it's quite high compared to what we're exposed to here, yeah.
Two questions. The first one is whether I've heard that people who have a higher viral load, like Epstein-Barr virus or Lyme, are more affected by EMFs than people who are much more healthy and their immune system is healthy. Is that true, or what is the mechanisms for that?
Again, we don't have enough clinical data, but anecdotally, I do believe that that's very likely, and certainly in the clinical setting, when we are talking about, whether it's Lyme disease, whether it's chronic EBV, that we definitely see that there's a greater constellation of symptoms and a greater sensitivity overall. I suspect that just based on some of the mechanisms that I've shared here, and again, it's likely that not all of the mechanisms that we haven't elucidated them yet, and there's much more that we need to know. But one of the ways, if we think about this generation of reactive oxygen species, right, and if we overload our system, our mitochondria with that, and if we're having to use up our antioxidants to deal with that, it's likely that then we're being more vulnerable to any other insults. So the way that I think about it is a total toxic load, and everything that our body has to kind of work against to neutralize. And so absolutely, if you have multiple infections, then at the same time, it's going to be more difficult for our body to counteract and effectively deal with those.
Have you looked at any of the biofield research? There is an edition, which is a special edition that I came across talking about human biofield. We have electrical current and generating a biofield, whether EMFs interact with that in a negative way to cause more issues.
I think that's really interesting, but I haven't. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.
Hi, I just wanted to ask you about the I have
Acoustic neuroma?
no, the
Thyroid? No.
I'm sorry, my mind is not working right. It's the
Bluetooth.
Yes, thank you.
You're pointing to your ears.
I heard that from one source, I don't remember where I heard it, but they said that it's actually worse than holding the phone up against your ear because it's literally delivering the EMF radiation directly into your ear, and because distance makes a difference. Can you comment on that?
Sure. So I can comment qualitatively on that, not quantitatively, but qualitatively. So yes, you're absolutely right. Distance matters, and so the farther the way that we are from the source, the less of the radiation we're going to get. But at the same time, the greater the power the source has, the more radiation we're going to get. So what I do know is that Bluetooth is a lower power source compared to our phone. Our phone is emitting much more power, but you're absolutely right in that it is closer to us. So when we take both of, that's why I said qualitatively, yes, I can comment, but quantitatively, how those interact and whether one outweighs the other, I can't tell you with great confidence other than I've read that the Bluetooth is the lesser evil based on the lower power. I don't know if anybody else in the audience, one of our other EMF experts can comment on that. Yes?
I just actually heard that the AirPods, using Bluetooth will make the radiation from the phone, they'll have a lot more power on the phone. I measured
On the phone.
So I've measured that the phone is pretty off the hook in terms of radiation exposure when used in conjunction with the Bluetooth. And then you have to enable various new antennas on your phone. And also it does, I mentioned last night about the magnetic induction field in through the brain, and that Dr. Jankovic has concerns about that because it goes right through the brain. So he actually advises no Bluetooth at all. And all these devices do have Bluetooth, and then people can also wear the headsets for hours on end, getting exposed.
Absolutely.
Listening to the music playlist as I see the students do, while their phone has to be, in a close proximity
On their body. Yes.
So for the Bluetooth signal.
Thank you. Oh, Taylor.
Go ahead. Oh, I was just going to say, I measured those AirPods, and at about this distance, I'll get about 1,000 microwatts per meter squared, so it's exponentially more than that when it's in your brain. It gives me the chills people wearing those. I would recommend any Bluetooth.
Absolutely.
What you measured 1,000 milliwatts?
Microwatts per meter squared. About it. Sorry.
Thank you.
On a practical note, I was told, and I just wanted to see if you could verify this, that there are, because what could we recommend to youth that use those, and the ones that are in, students and they say, oh, if I'm in a library, I want to be able to use something on my head.
Wired.
So, but the wired, from my understanding, you also get radio frequency exposure, right? The wired. And so I found out that they have one where there's an airspace, and that actually reduces. And I don't
the
know-
distance.
It's called AirPods. Yeah, the ones with the air tube. Would that lower the radiation? Okay, yeah. So that's a practical
Thank you for sharing.
alternative than a regular earphone. And then what was the other? I forgot what the other thing.
We need to wrap up because we need the next speaker to get set up in here, but Bojana is going to be around today.